Welcome. We are back with another episode of the Brothers-in-Law podcast. I'm very excited. We have a very special guest here today. I'll let him introduce himself in a minute. Um, as you can see, it's only the two of us today. My co-host Conrad Blackburn, our other fellow brother-in-law, he's in the middle of a trial right now. It's his first felony trial. It's a jury trial. It's been going on for a little over a week now, and tomorrow morning he'll be giving his first closing argument in a felony case. So he's knee deep right now, drafting that closing argument, mooting it, getting prepared for it. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time at the Brothers-in-Law podcast, we really try to just discuss all things criminal law related. And even sometimes we expand and do things that's not just related to criminal law instead. So if you just have never engaged with the law at all, this is the good podcast for you. I really want to do limited talking. So, Jeffrey, thank you for being here. And I want to I want to get into your story, but I want to do it backwards. So I
Okay.
want to start with where you're at now, and then get into how you got to where you're at. So can you tell us a little about yourself? Where you from? What do you do? Yeah, tell us.
Sure. So I'm an attorney and I run a nonprofit agency that I founded, the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice. Our mission is to free wrongfully convicted people and to pursue policy changes aimed at preventing those injustices from happening in the first place. So to date, we have freed 15 people. We've
Wow.
helped pass 9 laws since opening our door in 2011. I have a master's degree in criminal justice. My thesis is written on wrongful conviction, causes, and reform.
Wow, you said that really quickly. I want to make sure I highlight some things. So you said you opened doors 2011
Correct.
and you have freed 15 innocent people since then.
Correct.
Wow. Um, I know some people may be familiar with the Innocence Project. Would you say it's almost the
We
exact
are
same
very,
work?
yeah, we're similar mission
Okay.
to the Innocence Project. In fact, we pattern a lot of things off of them. The main difference between them and us is the Innocence Project only takes on DNA cases.
Okay.
DNA is only available in 5 to 12% of all serious felony cases.
Got you.
Whereas my foundation, we take on both DNA and non-DNA cases. And the other thing is we advocate for some policy changes
Hmm.
aimed at preventing wrongful conviction, which they don't. They obviously advocate for wrongful conviction
Right.
prevention legislation, but I think that the scope of issues of ours is a little bit bigger in terms of the number of issues.
Got you.
But then again, for proper context, I will share that they are doing policy work nationally,
Okay.
and the foundation is limiting its policy work to New York, Pennsylvania, and California. So they're obviously much larger than we are in terms of scope.
Got you.
We don't do cases together, but we do frequently collaborate
Okay.
on policy work and public education.
Okay. You mentioned you're an attorney.
I did.
Have you been an attorney since you opened doors, or how long have you been practicing attorney?
I've been practicing law for 4 years.
Okay.
So no, the foundation predates me, and
Okay.
once I basically I got tired of sitting in the front row of the courtroom.
Uh huh.
I got even though I might have worked equally with the attorney or otherwise assisted, and the attorney either collaborated with me. I might even have been the formal boss
Mm-hmm.
of the attorney back
Mm-hmm.
when we had in-house staff. But I got tired of sitting in the front row. I wanted to sit at the defense table. I wanted to represent some of the clients. I wanted to make some of the arguments.
Right.
Hence, going to law school, getting the law license. I have a personal caseload
Okay.
of 9 cases
Okay.
where a few of them I've entered cases that predated my law license. I entered as co-counsel,
Okay.
but most of them are new cases. I primarily am second seating,
Okay.
more experienced lawyers, often Oscar Michelin,
Mm-hmm.
an advisory board member of the foundation who's exonerated 9 people.
Okay.
But there are a couple of cases where I'm the lead attorney just to get the experience of being the lead attorney. And, Oscar, not having an ego, is
Mhm.
willing to second seat me, even though he has exonerated 9 people.
Got you. Hearing that you have a caseload of 9 is refreshing to hear. For those who don't know, I work as a public defender. Most people know that public defenders, no matter where you at, are overworked and have historically a high caseload. But also, I would imagine that the lifespan of a case is much more different in post conviction relief than in my work. When I the large amount of people who I represented were for misdemeanors or low level felonies, and the lifespan of a case can go anywhere from a month to 3 months. Most cases resolve within a year. Fair to say that's not your story. Like, what is the general lifespan of a case that you take on, if there is one?
Yeah, well, so far, I mean, 1 to 10, 1 to 10 years. I
Wow.
mean, and again, I'm inheriting history of the organization as a whole, which is longer than my
Right.
law license. I mean, the organization as a whole, we do have 14 active
Okay.
cases. I'm just involved in 9 of them. The others, I just once in a while get an update as to where
Okay.
they are. But to further build and support the point you made, though, I know that a lot of public defender organizations frequently have a caseload of 100 people.
Right. Whenever I first started, I was in like doing only misdemeanors for a good year and a half to 2 years, and my caseload averaged between 80 and 100. And now, we've due to all the reforms in the city and due to just having more attorneys in the office, we have been able to cut that to like maybe 60 to 70 is your average caseload. Mine's a little bit different because I handle now felonies and serious felonies, so the caseload balance varies based off of how many serious felonies you have. I handle some homicide cases as well. Um, but yeah, the caseload is really high, and often I think the main determining factor of whether someone's able to stay doing this work is whether or not they can tolerate the what comes with having such a high caseload.
Sure, I could see burnout being a factor,
Right.
but I also want to share that I think that in having not having limits on caseloads, I
Mm,
think the quality of defense of necessity is limited even as to the most skilled
right.
attorney. Because I mean, just if you're a college student,
Right.
to put it in perspective, what if you had to carry 12 classes
Right.
simultaneously? Could
Right.
obviously the quality of your work is going to be much lower, let
Hmm.
alone even the lower number where you said now caseloads are at now at 60.
Right.
I mean, that's still an overwhelming amount of cases and work,
Absolutely.
and how much pre-trial investigation can
Yeah.
you actually do, which of
Yeah.
course is key to forming your whole theory of the case and determining what your strategy and what your defense is.
Right.
Um, and I think probably one of the ways that that plays out is, um, if you're working with a less strong hand as
Hmm.
a lawyer, meaning that your pretrial investigation is limited, so you might not have done that much pretrial investigation, so you may have less evidence to work with,
Right.
which in turn sets the stage for you to get not exactly the best plea bargain
Right.
for somebody. Again, for the audience, to be most, I'd say about 98% of the cases,
Right.
end in a plea in this country. You agree with that stat?
100%.
Yeah. So I think that's the way that it most often most often works out. And sometimes though not always, that does that web kind of snares innocent people. I mean, there
Yeah.
have been judges that estimate that the percentage of innocent people that take pleas is at 10%.
Right. I mean, not only do I agree with that, but that actually plays out in my actual experience. About a month ago, I was going through our system to see how many people I've represented since I started working here.
Mm.
It was a little over 1,000, and I've only done 4 or 5 trials. So it highlights what the reality of how much cases resolve and how frequently cases go to trial.
I want to just really quickly segue to building into this point. Just
Yeah.
one last item, which is the foundation in collaboration with the local law firm.
Hmm.
We were recently last week we were able to exonerate Thomas Schaefer,
Wow.
who took a plea. He had pled guilty to, fourth degree grand larceny.
Hmm.
Mr. Schaefer did in fact steal 5 rings, but
Right.
those were costume jewelry, and the cumulative value was like $200 to $300.
Right.
He did not in fact steal the engagement ring, which was appraised at about $1,600. So
Mm-hmm.
despite that, not stealing that ring, and that's really what made it a grand larceny, a fourth degree felony.
Right.
It wouldn't have been a felony, I mean, and so he pled guilty
Right.
to that anyway.
Right.
And subsequently he turned his life around. He was been sober for 7 years and
Hmm.
married, child, at one point running an agency, a nonprofit agency, helping other people battle addictions,
Hmm.
moving on to an engineering firm, but the felony hindering his career.
Right.
not being able to get a license as a land surveyor, just a significant obstacle in that.
Right.
And so when some newly discovered evidence was came to light.
Right.
So the victim, which was his mother,
Yeah.
she found the ring a couple of months after reporting that it was stolen,
Wow.
but she never understood the significance that that ring being appraised at 1,600. That's what brought the value of the theft over the $1,000, which is $1,000 or more in New York's what made it a felony. I mean,
Right.
without that, he likely would have pled guilty to disorderly conduct,
Right.
gotten community service rather
Right.
than taking a felony
Right.
and ending up with 5 years probation. So
Wow.
we were able to exonerate him. But just that being just a illustration
Right.
of an innocent person taking a plea. I mean, he obviously knew that he didn't steal
Right.
the engagement ring,
Right.
yet nonetheless, just thinking about the trial penalty.
Yeah.
Which for those of us listening, the trial penalty is what the amount of time they tell you that you're facing, which is
Mm-hmm.
can be um, double, triple, sometimes even four times the amount
Right.
that a than what a punishment or a sentence is going to be if you should you just forego your
Right.
right to a trial and plead guilty.
Right. Wow. I think you brought up so many different points. I think when most people think about innocence, they think about the person who maintained their innocence through trial and then lost. But to imagine a world where people can plead guilty to something when they are innocent, the reasons why, I think you brought up all those reasons. And I have conversations daily with clients that are like, I want to fight this case. I want to go to trial, but I don't have the time. I don't have the time to come back to court for the next year. I don't want to risk mandatory state prison time. I don't want to risk losing my child. I don't want to risk losing all these things. So I'll go ahead and plead guilty, even though, I don't think that I am. So I think you're right. There's so many pressures that can lead someone to taking a guilty plea when they are in fact innocent.
And maybe the last point is I think when people do take pleas, I think that they're often, though not always, I think that they're just thinking short term. They're thinking about what the I want to get out from being incarcerated
Right.
pre-trial, for example.
Right.
Nobody is thinking about, for the most part, no one's thinking about, well, this conviction is going to be on my record. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to significantly impact, the quality of jobs that I'm going to be able to get.
Right.
What about my right to vote?
Right.
What about public housing?
Right.
What about a stigma? My kids or other family members. What are they going to think?
Right.
People don't often. And if I get arrested for something else, down the line, whether guilty or not,
Right.
if I'm convicted either by plea or by trial,
Mm-hmm.
that prior conviction that I just pled guilty to is
Right.
going to result in my getting an enhanced penalty. So I don't think
Right.
anyone's really thinking about
They're
that. They're
not
just thinking about,
the immediate.
the immediacy. Yeah, particularly when they're worried about, losing their job, losing their apartment,
Right.
losing their car. There's a car payment.
Right.
And even just having children or other people that they're responsible for.
Right. Wow. All right. So I want to continue now going backwards.
Okay.
Remind us the name of your organization.
The Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice.
Right.
And I want to shout out the coalition that we're part of. It could happen to you. We often partner
Right.
with them in doing policy work.
And as you introduced yourself earlier, this is a foundation named after you.
It is indeed.
So obviously there's some background, some connection that you have to the organization, to the foundation.
Fair to say.
All right.
You
So
want me to give the background?
yeah. I'm thinking we should just dive into it. I want for you to tell the audience the full story of what led you to creating the foundation, and start from the beginning. And I'll throw questions in here and there.
We're in 1990. We're in Westchester County, New York, suburbs. I'm 16 years old, and based upon a coerced false confession, prosecutorial misconduct, fraud by the medical examiner, terrible public defender. I was not only arrested for murder and rape, which I didn't commit, but I was also wrongfully convicted of that, despite the DNA not matching me. I was given a 15 to life sentence, despite the judge telling me at the sentencing that maybe I was innocent. Seven failed appeals later, and being denied parole based largely on my maintaining my innocence rather than expressing remorse and taking responsibility. I was denied parole. Ultimately, I was exonerated through further DNA testing through the DNA data bank. The
Hmm.
Innocence Project represented me, and so the test result not only affirmed the prior result, which is that the DNA didn't match me, but it simultaneously identified the actual perpetrator whose DNA was in the data bank because left free while I was doing time for his crime, he killed a second victim 3.5 years later after killing the victim in my case. So my charges were dismissed on actual innocence grounds. He was subsequently arrested and convicted and pled guilty.
You are a master at concision. I want to make sure we double back.
Let's
Um,
explore all the issues. Do your direct
let's do it.
examination.
So I want to go over the facts of the rape and murder.
Sure.
So, what were the facts of the rape and murder?
Yes. So the victim was 15-year-old. Her name was Angela Correa. She was an immigrant from Colombia. She'd been in the country for about a year and a half, leading a very sheltered life, as I later came to understand it.
Hmm.
And so one of her classes, she was in two of my classes as a freshman, one as a sophomore. I knew her name. She knew mine. That was the extent of it.
Hmm.
One of her classes was a photography class. The teacher assigned all the students in the class to take pictures of some foliage. He
Hmm.
had assigned a buddy system to assign male to female students, as a protection
Hmm.
thing. And so after Angela went home with her sister went to the restroom. She came out and Angela was gone. She decided to go and take the pictures by herself.
Okay.
The male student played hooky on the assignment, so he was never in this park. It was a wooded area which connected condominiums to a school,
Hmm.
and she was in there taking pictures, and she had the misfortune of coming across she was 15 at the time. She
Hmm.
had the misfortune of coming across a 29-year-old drug addict who was high. He
Hmm.
saw her, and so he, attacked, murdered, and raped her. And her body was found um, 3 days later, naked from the waist down. Peekskill was a small city,
Right.
Upper Westchester, population of approximately 25,000 people. Murders were pretty rare.
Yeah.
So when this murder happened, it created like a atmosphere of fear, rumor, paranoia.
Yeah.
Parents were concerned their own safety, the safety of their children.
Right.
Um, I got on the police radar.
Yeah. That's my question. How did you
Yes.
become a suspect?
Okay. Because I kind of lived a double life as a kid. I didn't
Okay.
really think of it that way at the time, but I realize now that's what it was.
Hmm.
So there's my life after school where I was kind of like the all American kid and I played all types of sports. And there were a lot of other kids that lived in the apartment complex and the surrounding areas. And for the most part, whatever I suggested that we do would be what we did. We
Right.
would play stickball, basketball, swim, Monopoly,
Hmm.
movies, bike ride, whatever.
Right.
But that's after school. In school, I'm those are a different set of kids. I'm not familiar with them. They're a year older than I am also.
Hmm.
And so I'm quiet to myself. I'm tight. I'm withdrawn. And
Hmm.
so in the course of the police investigation, they interviewed a lot of students from the high school, and some of them told the police that they might want to talk to me. So
Mm.
that's how I got on their radar. Secondary thing is that I was a sensitive teenager.
Hmm.
This was my first brush with death, and I had an emotional reaction. And the police thought that, given that I barely knew the victim, that was suspicious. Although, in a larger sense, I
Right.
wasn't all that different
Right.
from everyone else in the city. I mean, murders were rare, and this affected many people emotionally to the point that free mental health services were offered to anyone who wanted it in Peekskill.
Wow.
Now, those two factors, what was added was that the Peekskill police, they got a psychological profile from the NYPD, which purported to have the psychological characteristics of the actual perpetrator. And I had
Okay.
the misfortune of matching that. Well, it's probably somebody she knew, likely somebody in the high school,
Hmm.
a loner,
Even though you barely knew her.
even though I barely knew her.
Right.
Those were the three characteristics. And
Got you.
boy, do those things really narrow it down.
Right.
Not.
Right.
Okay, so that's how I got on their radar. That's separate. I'm going to get to how I was arrested now.
Okay. Okay.
So before I entered my teenage years, I dreamed about being a police officer when I grew up,
Okay.
and that intersected with this tactic the police did. So I had about 6 weeks worth of interactions with the police officers, in which they'd start out talking to me as a suspect.
Hmm.
And when they'd push too hard, I'd get frightened and I'd want to get away from them.
And how are these conversations happening at the precinct, at your home, at the school?
Well, initially they intercepted me on my way to high school, but at other times I went to the police station. At
Okay.
other times we met at different places in the community that they prearranged for me to meet at.
Okay.
And they'd start out questioning me as a suspect. And when they'd push too hard and I'd get frightened and I'd want to get away from them,
Hmm.
they switched it up. And Jeff as this junior detective helper theme was developed.
Mm.
So look, Jeff, the kids won't talk freely around us. They will around you. Let us know if you hear anything. Stop in from time to time. They'd ask me opinion questions and congratulate me that my opinion was correct.
Like, what's an example of that?
So they told me that her keys were missing,
Uh huh.
for example. And then they asked me to guess, well, what type of keychain do you think it was? And so I thought about it and I thought, well, maybe it's one of those I love New York keychains,
Uh huh.
reflecting that she was an immigrant from Colombia that had been in the country,
Hmm.
and they said, well, yeah, you're right. That's right.
Right.
And tell us which route. What route do you think that she took? But all that required me to do was think about where her house was, which the
Right.
police had pointed that out, and
Right.
I knew where the body was. There was a map in the newspaper,
Uh huh.
and they had also taken me to the crime scene.
Right.
So it wasn't that hard from a logical point of view to figure out. It's
Right.
it's like doing a maze
Right. If
almost.
somebody would have asked me what route did somebody take from my office to the courthouse, I would have. I can guess what that route would be.
Right. That's an example. And
Yeah.
and at other times they would feed me facts. Like they took me to the crime scene
Hmm.
and one officer said, well, she was attacked here
Hmm.
and it looks like her body was dragged to over here. People put leaves on top of her almost like they were trying to protect her after that from the elements, you know. Is that what happened?
Wow.
And then another officer would ask me questions about it and I'm just regurgitating what they're telling me, not realizing like I'm not their junior detective helper, I'm not their confidant. They're asking me questions like I'm a suspect. They're trying to see if I have some sort of guilty knowledge
Right.
that then they can use to justify arresting me.
Right.
But they're overreaching me.
And you're
uh,
how old at this time?
I'm 16 years old.
And where were your parents throughout all these times where they were interrogating you and speaking to you? What was their presence and involvement?
Non-existent. So they didn't know. My mother knew one time after the fact,
Hmm.
and then she told me she didn't want me to speak with the police.
And it was
But
legal for them to speak with you
it was
without
legal
them.
at 16. It was legal, yes. But I want to say, despite her not wanting me to speak with them, I didn't understand why. Because look, I didn't do anything. I
Right.
don't even know anything.
Right.
And on top of that, they're telling me that they need my help to solve the crime. What could possibly happen?
Right.
And then also, I'm 16 years old, and that's really the age where there's struggles between kids and parents. Authority, rebellion, autonomy,
Right.
tensions come up,
Right.
and so that was in the middle of that time period. And I think that that's the same time period connected to that, where we think that as kids we think our parents are stupid. We're
Hmm.
smarter than them when
Right.
actually it's not that way at all. But we
Right.
think that it is. So that was a factor. And then they're enticing me with this Jeffers Junior Detective helper.
Hmm.
My father was never involved in my life in any capacity, never met him,
Hmm.
at least not till after I was exonerated.
Hmm.
And that intersected with the good cop, bad cop tactic, Mutt and Jeff. So where one officer would pretend that he's my friend and the other is more aggressive. And then in time, I began to look at the officer who was pretending to be my friend as a father figure.
Mm.
So that all went down for 6 weeks. Eventually, they said, look, we got some new information in the file. We want to share that with you. That's going to allow you to be more helpful to us.
Okay.
You have to take and pass a polygraph test first, though. And we stop asking you questions like you're a suspect. You'll show us you're innocent, too.
Right.
So the next day, instead of going to the high school, I went to the police station. My mother and grandmother thought I was in school.
Mm.
So therefore, they had no idea that anything was wrong. So they didn't call around looking for me.
Hmm.
They drove me from Peekskill across county lines, 40 minutes away by car. They drove me to the town of Brewster, which was in Putnam County.
Hmm.
The psychological overreach continues. They put me in the car by myself with the officer pretending to be my friend. The bad cop and the lieutenant are in different vehicle.
Hmm.
The polygraphist himself, Daniel Stevens, he's a Putnam County Sheriff's investigator. but he's dressed like a civilian, never identifies himself as law enforcement, never reads me my rights. I have no idea he's a cop.
Mm-hmm.
I have no attorney present. They didn't give me anything to eat the whole time I'm there.
Mm-hmm.
They gave me a 4-page brochure which explains how the polygraph worked,
Mm-hmm.
but had a lot of big words in it that I didn't understand. So I figured, well, I'm here to help the police. What does it matter?
Right.
Let's just get on with it.
Right.
From there, they put me in a small room. He gave me countless cups of coffee to get me nervous.
Right.
And then he attaches me to the machine and he launches into his third degree tactic. So he raises his voice at me. He invades my personal space. He keeps asking me the same questions over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And each hour that passes by, my fear increases in proportion to the time. He kept that up for 6.5 to 7 hours. Towards the end, he said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the polygraph that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." And when he said that, that shot my fear to the roof.
Mm-hmm.
And then the officer who had been pretending to be my friend, he came in the room and said, "Look, they're going to harm you. I've been holding them off. I can't do this anymore. Look, you got to help yourself. Just tell them what they want to hear.
Mm-hmm.
You can go home afterwards. You're not going to be arrested." Being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, I wasn't thinking about the long term. I was just concerned with my safety in the moment. I was in fear of my life. The fact that I didn't know where I was and no one else did either loomed quite large in my mind.
Right.
Then there's this push pull dynamic. On one hand, the possibility of harm, and
Right.
on the other, this false life preserver he's thrown me. So I took the out which he offered and I made up a story based on the information that they gave me that day in the 6 weeks run up to everything. By the time it was said and done, I had collapsed on the floor in a fetal position, crying uncontrollably. Obviously, I was arrested. I was charged with murder and rape.
And how long were you in that interrogation room during
Six
that?
and a half to 7 hours.
Wow.
I want to add that the interrogation was not videotaped. It was not audio tape. There was
Mm-hmm.
no signed confession.
Mm-hmm.
It was just their word for it. And when they came to court later, they left the threat and false promise out of their story. So
Wow.
I'll stop on the confession. There's another part of the story that's part of it at trial. But let me stop and let you ask a question or make a comment
Right.
first.
Yeah. I have a few comments.
I
First
would
is
imagine.
I was recently at a trial skills training back in July, just a
Okay.
few months ago. And at this training, they give lawyers, a fake problem, and for 2 weeks, we're learning trial skills, cross examination, opening, direct, all these things. My case was a case that involved a false confession.
Okay.
Um, I had, like I told you earlier, I had been doing this work for 7 years, and fair to say, most of the confessions in my case have been sincere and not false. So when I was doing this assignment, in my mind, it was entirely theoretical, and I had not never engaged with somebody who actually had given a false confession. I've heard of stories, and I believe, the Corey Weiss with the Central
Yes.
Park Five. He's another prime
Correct.
example of
Correct. I know
how,
Corey, but yeah.
yeah, it's a
Mhm.
perfect example of how police tactics can lead to a false confession. But I had never encountered it, or encountered somebody who had encountered it
Sure.
firsthand. So, hearing your story, like, contextualizes to me that these false confessions happen, and I feel like your average person, it's hard for them to understand that. Why would somebody say they did something that they did not do? And I guess it's something that I think most your average person won't be able to wrap their mind around. But I think the way you just explained it makes sense. When you take you were a kid, when you take a 16-year-old kid, you remove them from their family. You put them in a room for 6 or 7 hours. You don't give them food. You are doing all these mental gymnastics and all these things to them. It's very obvious and very easy to understand why somebody would say something to get out of a situation. So I just appreciate your story so much because it highlights, number one, how nefarious police can be, and number two, that false confessions are an actual thing. Um,
I want to just comment on them being an actual thing. Just really quickly, I wanted to just share that coerced false confessions have caused wrongful convictions in 29% of the DNA proven wrongful convictions.
right.
And while adults have given coerced false confessions, that particularly vulnerable populations are youth and people with mental health
Hmm.
issues.
Wow. I feel like something that's coming to my mind right now is, if I were to prepare a trial for someone who gave a false confession.
Hmm.
The first part of any trial, any jury trial, is voir dire, where you're
Correct.
you're questioning potential jurors. And I know for a fact I would have to question the potential jurors on whether or not they can buy that somebody would confess to a crime that they did not commit. I feel like some people would be like, okay, maybe. But my second question would be, okay, does that still apply to a serious crime? Do you think somebody would confess to a rape or a murder that they did not commit? And I can just imagine your average potential juror be like, no, I don't understand how that could happen. So I think the work that you're doing is just so important because it helps, permeate these misconceptions that people hold so dearly and have held for so long. And I think someone who engages with your story, it can really transform them. So once they hear your story, if they now get called to jury duty, they can understand, oh, somebody could falsely confess, and then I know what to look for.
Correct. And speaking of a trial tactic, I want to quickly say that if you are defending a case where there's a false confession,
Hmm.
you have to answer that confession. You have to explain that confession. You have to disprove that confession
Right.
in as many ways as you can. So, I'm a firm believer that in a false confession case, that the defense needs to have you need to have your client take the stand, explain, why they falsely confess, address any of the details, disprove any of the details. So if there's an alibi or some other piece of external evidence that you could use,
Hmm.
certainly calling a false confession expert.
Hmm.
The experts, of course, don't give a aren't allowed to say whether a particular confession is false or not. That's a jury question, but they
Right.
are allowed to share contextual information, like what are the factors that have been proven to lead an innocent person to confess, because that type of knowledge is beyond the ken of what an average juror is. And so,
Right.
rounding out your defense that way is really important.
That's helpful. All right. So you get arrested, and how does the story continue?
Yeah. So before I go to trial, the results of a DNA test come in from the FBI lab. Seminal fluid found in and around the victim don't match me.
Okay.
But rather than acknowledge they made a mistake, they continue to prosecute full speed ahead. To counter the DNA exclusion, the prosecutor got the medical examiner to commit fraud, to commit perjury.
Wow.
When there's an autopsy that's done, there's written and audio notes which are taken contemporaneously as findings are made.
Hmm.
So it was only 6 months after doing the autopsy, hundreds of autopsies later, only after the DNA doesn't match me, that the medical examiner says, try to follow this now. This is
Okay.
tricky.
Okay.
Okay. He says he remembers that he forgot to document medical evidence which he claimed showed that the victim had been sexually active, which is what opened the door for the prosecutor to argue, aha, that is how the DNA doesn't match Deskovic, and yet he's guilty.
Right.
She was sleeping around.
Slut shamed her.
Right. Then, taking it a step further, he mentions another youth by name that he claimed had likely slept with the victim, but he never tried to prove that. He never, for example, got a DNA test from him.
Right.
He never called him as a witness to
Right.
give verbal tests. He just threw the suggestion in the air.
Right.
And he got away with that because of two things. Firstly, the victim's family was not coming to court, so they
Hmm.
had no idea of the terrible things that they were basically trashing her reputation in the furtherance of trying to convict me. So that's number
Right.
one.
Right.
But number two, and more importantly, the public defender that I had allowed him to get away with it. He essentially didn't defend me. Here's how he failed me.
Hmm.
He never interviewed or called as a witness my alibi. I was actually playing wiffle ball when the crime happened. He never explained to the jury the significance of the DNA not matching me. He never used that to argue that proved the confession was coerced and false.
Right.
He rarely met with me. When he did meet with me, I tried to explain to him that I was innocent and what happened in the interrogation room, but he was always shutting me up. At one time, he told me he didn't care if I was guilty or innocent.
Mhm.
He never, he literally never cross-examined the medical examiner. He stood up in court and, with a smile on his face, told the medical examiner, "You're going to be pleased to know that I don't have a single question for you."
Wow.
Lastly, my lawyer should have never represented me because of a conflict of interest. The youth that the prosecutor was falsely saying had slept with the victim
Hmm.
was represented by another member of that public defender agency, and
Hmm.
specifically by the lawyer who was supposed to be supervising him on my case. So that conflict prevented the defense from asking him to give a DNA sample. It prevented the defense from calling him as a witness to explode the whole consensual sex theory.
Right.
Um, you want to comment? Because I have a couple of other
Yeah,
irregularities, but I
yeah,
think I should stop at this juncture and let you ask a further question or comment, whatever you want to do.
yeah. I just want to highlight what you said because
Please.
you are so great at being concise, but I want to make sure that people understand just the significance of a lot of what you're saying.
Sure.
So the district attorney's office, they tested the DNA from her,
Yes.
compared it to yours, and it
Correct.
did not match you at all.
Correct.
And then 6 months later, fair to say, this autopsy, the person, the medical examiner had. I'm
Well,
sorry,
you're getting the order wrong. They did
okay,
the autopsy.
did the
They
autopsy,
did the autopsy, and then 6 months after that, they tested the DNA. It doesn't
right?
match me, and then he wants to revise his findings to open a door for the prosecution
Got
to
you,
continue on with the case.
got you. And it was 6 months after he had probably done many more other DNA
He,
examinations,
well, he did many. Well, he wasn't a DNA expert. He did many other autopsies.
autopsies, right?
Correct.
And then 6 months later, he has this. Oh, I remember this additional evidence.
Correct.
Wow. And none of that was highlighted, like you said, by your lawyer. So
Correct.
you were failed by many different people at many different stages by the main person that was supposed to be, your advocate.
Exactly. Yes, that's true.
Okay. Continue.
Okay. Now, if all that wasn't bad enough, there was several other irregularities.
Okay.
Well, all right. Before that, I want to mention one other aspect of police misconduct. I want to mention a couple of two other things of police misconduct.
Right.
So, firstly, not being content with having coerced the false confession out of me, they also falsely attributed a statement to me. The
Mm-hmm.
police claimed that I said to them during the confession
Mm-hmm.
that I didn't know if the perpetrator ejaculated or not. And that word was not in my vocabulary as a 16-year-old. But
Yeah.
the reason why they fabricated that is they were trying to help the prosecutor counter the negative DNA test result. And
Got
if you
you.
look at the police reports as to the false confession,
Mm-hmm.
that statement doesn't appear in their early police reports. It only comes in after the DNA doesn't match me. So that's one thing.
Right.
Second thing is after the DNA didn't match me, I learned this many years later.
Mm-hmm.
The police went back out into the field and they interviewed 17 witnesses who knew the victim in one capacity or another.
Mm-hmm.
All of them told the police that Angela didn't have a boyfriend, there was no consensual sex. But the police purposely didn't document any of those witness interviews, and therefore that there was nothing to turn over to the defense. So we
Right.
never knew that. That would have been helpful
Right.
information to have to battle this confession.
Right.
So that's a couple of other aspects of misconduct. But in terms of irregularities in the trial, firstly, polygraph test results are not admissible because the polygraph is not scientific. It's often frightened by guilty, innocent, excuse me, it's often failed by innocent, frightened people.
Right.
Intelligence agents and military service, some of them are even taught how to beat the polygraph.
Right.
So my only point is that the polygraph is not scientific.
Right.
Okay, and therefore it's not admissible unless both sides agree.
Right.
We never agreed. The defense never agreed.
So one good thing, yeah, he defense lawyer
Well,
did.
one good thing he did, right, except that the trial judge allowed the testimony in anyway. His rationale was, well, this alleged confession happened while you were being polygraphed. So he decided to allow the polygraphist to repeatedly tell the jury that uh, not only that I was polygraphed, but that he allowed the polygraphist to repeatedly tell the jury that I failed the polygraph when I denied committing the crime, while at the same time banning my lawyer from asking him any questions about the methods that he used to arrive at his opinion.
Wow.
So, could you imagine for a second
Yeah.
the prejudicial impact that that had to have had
Right.
against me?
Right.
So, that, and the next thing is that the jury asked to see the bra. And
Okay.
that intersected with one of the statements that it was coerced out of me. I said that I ripped her bra off.
Mm-hmm.
There's some bras that the way that they're made,
Mm-hmm.
you can't rip it off. It's not possible.
Right.
So the jury asked to see the bra, and it was at that moment that the judge said that the victim's clothes, including the bra, had been left in the courtroom over the weekend. That the janitors apparently thought it was garbage. It was thrown out. It was no longer available to be viewed. He refused to give me a mistrial. He refused to strike testimony about the bra. He substituted for the bra a photo, which he said, and this is like verbatim,
Mm-hmm.
you can almost see the bra in this photo. Last thing, on the third day of jury deliberation, and we're deep into December,
Mm-hmm.
jury sent out a note, and they asked, well, if we can't come up with a verdict, are we going to be kept sequestered over the Christmas holiday? And I learned many years later
Mm-hmm.
that at that point it was an 11-1 vote. It was for a conviction. There was a holdout juror that thought I was innocent,
Mm-hmm.
but they were all pressing him. And when the answer to that note came back in, that ratcheted the pressure up.
Right.
Nobody wanted to be there over the Christmas holiday, not even him.
Right.
And as a result of that, he switched his vote, and I was found guilty.
Wow. As a lawyer hearing your story, all that's coming to mind is there are so many grounds for appeal, so many wrongs that happened to you during your trial. And then you said earlier that you
Lost
filed
7
for
appeals.
appeal 7 times.
I did. I did. Well, that kind of opens the door for me to go into that
Yeah,
a
do
little
it.
bit.
Go ahead.
Please. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's appropriate we're doing that in the Brothers in Law
Right.
podcast in particular.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, I have a different lawyer now. I have an 18B
Uh-huh.
lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
I'll let you explain what that is later on in the back end. But so she argues that I'm innocent. That takes the form of, of arguing that there's legally insufficient evidence,
Uh-huh.
that the prosecution hasn't proven guilt beyond reasonable doubt, that
Mm-hmm.
the verdict's against the weight of the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
My Fifth Amendment rights being violated was argued by the means of the interrogation.
Mm-hmm.
My Sixth Amendment right to confrontation, it was argued that that was violated by allowing the polygraphist to testify while barring my lawyer from cross-examining methods.
Mm-hmm.
The judge giving the evidence being thrown out is another ground.
Right.
Another ground is that the judge gave the jury the wrong definition of custody.
Wow.
In New York, under People versus Yuckel,
Mm-hmm.
the definition is, whether reasonably whether a prudent person, right,
Mm-hmm.
innocent of any crime,
Would have felt free to
would
leave.
would would feel like they're free to go.
Right.
So instead of the judge, and that obviously impacts the jury analysis about whether or not the confession is whether the defendant's in custody, whether or not the statements are voluntary or not. It impacts that analysis.
Right.
So instead of giving that definition, the trial judge told the jury that custody means, you're not going to believe this, I swear, but it's true. Custody means that if the police stopped me on the street with guns drawn, taking me against my will into the police headquarters. Now, yes,
That's so wild to be like so wrong and to communicate that to a jury.
correct. Ground 8 was that that the judge erred in bringing the jury to the crime scene. So my lawyer argued that the crime scene being a different time of the year, it could not have remained the same as a matter of law. So that and then another thing is the lawyer argued that one of the judge's rulings, the judge allowed this detective. He claimed that during one of my encounters with them during the 6 weeks, he
Mm-hmm.
claimed that I chewed a bottle cap while I was there,
Mm-hmm.
and that the day after the arrest that he returned back to the crime scene and he found a chewed bottle cap there.
And that's how they got your DNA.
But there was no DNA there. It's just the bottle
Just the
cap.
bottle cap.
Just yeah, right. So my lawyer argued that that was prejudicial, that the prejudicial value exceeded the probative value.
Right.
And last thing is my lawyer argued that the trial judge was prejudiced because different statements like that he had made on the record, like one time he had voiced concern that the prosecution be protected from an inordinate burden of proof. The judge made comments about worrying about what the impact of the evidence being missing would
Mm-hmm.
be on the prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
So in total, 10 issues of law
Right.
were argued. I think it's clear cut
Right.
that every one of those arguments
Right. Are valid.
are valid.
Right.
So in their decision, the court ruled that I was free to come and go as I wanted. and that the statements were voluntary, which totally ignores the fact that I'm 16 years old and I'm driven 40 minutes away by a county with out of county with no independent way of
So
escape.
they affirmed that you were not in custody.
Yeah, they said I was not. They affirmed I was not in custody. That the statements were voluntary.
Yeah.
They ruled that there was overwhelming evidence of guilt, which is kind of a head scratcher because the DNA doesn't match me. They
Right.
only have this confession obtained under highly questionable circumstances.
Right.
Then they knocked out all of my issues. All those credible issues got knocked out in one sentence. We have examined appellant's remaining contentions and found them to either be without merit or else not preserved for review.
Wow.
They ruled 5-0 against me, and it was all downhill from there. The re-argument motion was denied in one word, denied. The New York Court of Appeals declined to give me permission to appeal to them. Now that's three. I lost uh, in federal court habeas corpus petition because my lawyer was given incorrect information by the court clerk regarding the new filing procedure. So my petition arrived 4 days too late. So I lost that way there. I appealed that ruling to the Federal Court of Appeals. Um, I was given permission to appeal to them. My lawyer argued that this was not a delay caused by me or my attorney, but by the misinformation of the court clerk. That upholding a ruling like that would cause a miscarriage of justice to continue, and that reversing the ruling would open the door to more sophisticated testing. But again, the district attorney opposed. The judges upheld that ruling. One of them was future U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor.
Mm-hmm.
My lawyer moved to re-argue the case in front of them, requesting that all the judges on the circuit hear it and make a ruling, which is called en banc.
Mm-hmm.
But that was denied by those same two judges. And then the U.S. Supreme Court declined to give me permission to appeal to them. That was my 7 appeals.
Denied 7 times. So how does your case end up resulting in, you being freed?
Right. Well, when your appeals are over, the only way back in a court is if there's a retroactive change in the law,
Mm-hmm.
or else if you can find some previously unknown evidence, which probably would have resulted in a different outcome.
Mm-hmm.
I had no money to hire an attorney or an investigator, hence a letter writing campaign. I
Mm-hmm.
wrote large law firms, nonprofit organizations, faith based institutions, you name it. I wrote, if I could come up with a task that somebody not in the legal field, some action that they could take,
Mm-hmm.
which could then result in something else happening, could set in motion a chain of events that ultimately culminated into my getting some legal representation.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote the letter. I explained I was innocent.
Mm-hmm.
DNA. This is what you can do. This is
Right.
how it can help me.
Right.
Never assumed that they would understand how they could help me.
Right.
So that went on for 4 years. I wrote letters for 4 years like that, rarely getting responses other than the occasional no.
About how many letters do you think you wrote?
Several hundred, I
Wow.
would guess.
Wow.
And ultimately, one of those letters that I wrote, which was in care of I wrote a book author in care of the publishing company.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody in the publishing company instead sent the letter to an investigator. The investigator wrote me. I sent her the DNA paperwork. She believed in my innocence.
Mm-hmm.
That was Claudia Whitman. And she said, look, I live in Colorado. My other home is in Maine.
Mm-hmm.
I can't work on your case. You're in New York. It's too far. I'll help you network, though.
Okay.
So she tried to get people to take my case. And one of her ideas was the winning one. She suggested I write the Innocence Project, again, a nonprofit organization here in Manhattan that
Mm-hmm.
frees wrongfully convicted people in cases across the country in those instances where DNA testing can demonstrate innocence,
Right.
and key part here, in which no prior testing had been conducted. So I originally wrote them in 92, 93.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, again, that was their criteria, and they would just simply get testing and then introduce that evidence to court using the newly discovered evidence legal theory, legal
Mm-hmm.
argument.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't available when I originally wrote them because the DNA had already excluded me. It wasn't new.
Right.
So you might say that I was excluded a little bit too soon for my own good.
Man.
Fast forwarding back, Miss Whitman said, look, the DNA data bank has been created. Therefore, the prior denial is irrelevant. Just
Mm-hmm.
write them. So I did, and she lobbied them to take my case.
Mm-hmm.
She got other respected legal professionals to write them also.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I got lucky that one of the intake workers, who's now a lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
Maggie Taylor, when the Innocence Project attorneys did not want to take my case, she and they declined to take it. She presented it a second time, different theories as to how what could be done with the DNA to demonstrate innocence.
Mm-hmm.
And when they declined to take it a second time, she came up with a third. She brought it, represented it a third time. This time using a theory that I had articulated,
Right.
which was I mentioned, well, what about the DNA data bank? So they agreed to take the case
Wow.
based on the data bank. So getting their legal representation was the first key.
Right.
Second key is that the former Westchester District Attorney, Janine Pirro, who was not the DA when I was convicted, but was the DA prior to my first appeal being denied. So she had fought against me in the
Right.
7 appeals. She had blocked me from getting further DNA testing several times.
Right.
She left office, so her successor was willing to allow me to get the testing.
Okay.
And the third thing is we got lucky that the actual perpetrator's DNA was in the data bank, so that when we took that crime scene DNA evidence and put it in the data bank, it
Mm-hmm.
matched him. And confronted with that, he confessed that he had committed the crime,
Mm-hmm.
and from there my charges were dismissed on actual innocence grounds, and he was subsequently arrested and convicted and pled guilty for the crime.
Wow. So after serving how many years in prison?
I served 16 years in prison.
16 years.
Yeah, and by the way, at the time he got caught for killing the victim in my case, he had served 13 and a half years in prison for the other murder that he had committed. So we had concurrently did time, not the same prison,
Right.
but in the New York State prison system.
Wow. Oh, okay. So you get released,
Yes.
and I don't want to ask you the obvious question.
Ask the obvious or not so obvious
yeah,
question.
I want to
Whatever
ask
you
you the
want. Everything's on the table.
how did you come to founding your organization?
Mhm.
And I guess there's a number of things you could have done with your life after being released. You said you wanted to be a police officer before this all happened. Maybe going into law enforcement, maybe going into academia. Maybe there's so many avenues I think you could have taken. What led you to founding your organization and then dedicating your life to doing innocence work?
So I spoke at the press conference. I spoke like 2.5 hours off the cuff.
Okay.
Everything I ever wanted to say in 16 years, can never get anyone to hear. It all came out, and just as I thought I was ending things, that is when another topic crossed my mind. So a light bulb went off, and I thought, I've read while I was in prison because I used to collect articles about people who were exonerated, using motivation to continue, and I'd study also and see who helped them, what
Mhm.
route did they take.
Okay.
So I remembered, that sometimes people who were exonerated, they got on the speaking circuit after that.
Right.
So I decided to do that. So I started speaking. I caught on as a weekly columnist, so adding writing. I got introduced to meeting with elected officials, and then I figured out how to keep the media attention going. As long as there's some new angle, some new thing, I can
Hmm.
keep that going.
Right.
My motivation at that point was, I used to be frustrated because normally there would, when someone be exonerated, there'd be a quick 5 minutes of fame, and then you would keep doing media, and then you wouldn't hear from them anymore.
Right.
And so I kind of said to myself, you were critical of people before, and now you're unexpectedly free.
Right.
Go show them how it's done.
Right.
Right. So I did that for 5 years. Got a scholarship from Mercer University, finished a bachelor's degree,
Hmm.
didn't get into law school, decided that getting the master's from John Jay, writing a thesis on wrongful conviction cause and reform, that the additional credential would assist me more as an advocate.
Hmm.
But I want to say that up until that point, had only been able really to nibble on the edges of trying to free people.
Right.
So I could write about a case, my capacity as a columnist. I could facilitate getting media coverage for other cases. I could allow my name to be used in a press release.
Right.
I could show up to court for the visual. If the judge recognizes me, then maybe there'll be pay a little bit more attention to the case in front of them.
But you couldn't represent
I
people.
couldn't represent people. Right. I could even do grassroots and try to, pack the court. You
Right.
couldn't represent people. Couldn't directly try to free people.
Right.
And so when I was able to receive some financial compensation,
Right.
I wanted to go to the next level and get involved in that. So, I donated some of the money to start the organization. And I had an in-house team. I had a lawyer, investigator, um, I had someone who was running the legal department, and I had an office manager.
Mm-hmm.
We started having success. And again, I got tired of sitting in the front row of the court after a while.
Mm-hmm.
And so I actually was so I was at the Legal Institute. It's located physically on Pace Law School in White Plains, and these judges had brought me in to speak about some wrongful conviction topics.
Mm-hmm.
And in chatting in the hallway afterwards, Judge Hines Radix said to me, you know this topic better than a lot of lawyers, even better than some of us judges. That's why we had you come here and speak. Why don't you just go to law school? Why don't you just get the credential, just get the license? And that kind of ended the debate in my mind. So I wasn't sure, did I want to get a law degree, knowing it was going to be 3 hard years, majority of the study of which would have nothing to do with criminal law and doing wrongful conviction work,
Right.
and then the difficulty of passing the bar and the intensity of that,
Right.
or did I want to instead go the doctoral route and get a PhD,
Mm-hmm.
or did I want to just stay at the master's level? But when she said that to me, it kind of ended the debate. And so I made a second foray into going to law school. And this time I did get in, and I was able to graduate law school and ultimately get the law license.
Wow. Unfortunately, we are almost at our time, but I want to ask a few more things before we wrap up. So I want to just highlight your foundation,
Hmm.
and as we were speaking before we, on the record, you only take on actual innocent cases. Can you? So
Hmm.
can you speak about the kind of cases that you actually
Yes,
take on?
yeah, yeah. My law practice is limited to wrongful conviction cases. That takes the format of, I'm in-house counsel for the foundation, so we only take on cases where, number one, we believe someone's innocent, and number two, we see a potential route to victory.
Mm-hmm.
I do have it. I do have. I'm a sole practitioner. I have a law firm, and so anyone that we exonerate through the nonprofit, I help them get compensation on the back end through my law firm, partnering with more experienced lawyers. So the commonality of it is I only use my law degree and law license for working on wrongful conviction cases.
Okay. Okay. So how does that look? So let's say someone who is not innocent but was claiming their innocence, they reach out to your organization to say, "Hey, can you take my case?" How do you vet their claim?
Sure. So one time somebody wrote us in a second time. We had rejected their case because we didn't find it viable.
Mm-hmm.
And in that first letter, he alleged that he um, had engaged in an act of self-defense. And
Mm-hmm.
normally we don't take those cases because where you're going to go to prove that, unless there's
Right.
some unknown evidence that could help substantiate the
Right.
self-defense. But usually that's sussed out in the front end.
Right.
Nonetheless, he made the claim. We considered it, and we didn't see it, so we rejected the case.
Right.
He came back around to us 3 years later, not realizing that we keep copies of the correspondence. And this time, he claimed that a new alibi witness had bubbled to the surface, who previously was uncooperative,
Mm-hmm.
and that witness would place him several hundred miles away from the crime.
Wow.
So that happened on one. Another person that we, in my case, we rejected, was a corrections officer
Mm-hmm.
who alleged that when she heard somebody breaking in, that rather than confront, and she had a firearm,
Right.
that she instead decided to hide in a toy box, and that while in the toy box she fainted, and that we
Wow.
just we couldn't believe that.
Right.
Okay, so we passed on that. My favorite, and I'll want to get to my favorite, is this guy was renting a room in a house, and weapons were found in the living room,
Uh-huh.
and he alleged that other people had access to the room, and therefore it was someone else's guns.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't make sense to us, because if that was true, wouldn't they be taking a chance that when you came home and found the guns, you'd call the police yourself? So when we asked a further question, here's
Right.
where you're really going to laugh. His answer at that point to our follow up was, that the police had no right to enter his house. It was a search and seizure issue, and therefore that evidence was erroneously admitted and should to court should not have been considered by the court, and by extension, we shouldn't consider the firearms because it was illegally obtained. So we laughed about it and declined the case.
Wow.
In terms of my motivation, I want to be the person that I wish that I had when I was on the outside. That's
Yeah.
one thing.
Yeah.
A second thing is I feel so blessed that I've had educational opportunities that other people haven't had.
Right.
So I feel a tremendous amount of moral responsibility to
Right.
do to do to do what I can, and I really can't forget about the men and women that I metaphorically left behind. And so, based on that, I do this work, and it's healing, it's cathartic,
Right.
it makes a difference. It makes my suffering count for something, and
Hmm.
I make sense of everything that happened to me in a kaleidoscopic type way. And I think I'm doing the work that I'm supposed to do in the world. And with that realization, I have an inner peace. I'm not angry. I want to enjoy my life as much as I can.
Hmm.
Can't do that if I'm simultaneously angry and bitter.
Right.
I feel like I lost so much already as is. Why would I want to, in effect, lose the rest of my life?
Right.
And if I was angry or bitter, I would really. It's not like I'd be impacting any of the people involved in what happened. I would really be the only loser in that scenario.
Right.
And the vehicle that allows me to actualize that is I take the energy that I feel and I channel it into the advocacy work that I do.
Story is very inspiring and very, motivating. The way we end each episode is we ask each guest and the host to leave the people in the audience with like one last, nugget of wisdom, game, whatever it is. You've already given us so much, fruitful information, but if you could leave the people with one last piece of wisdom, what would that be?
Universal formula for overcoming adversity that I've personally come up with on reflecting on my life as a whole.
Hmm.
Have a goal,
Hmm.
have a realistic plan,
Hmm.
meaning you should be able to look at it 3 or 4 different ways and say to yourself, well, yeah, I could see how that might work.
Right.
And who wants to carry out a plan that you don't think
Right.
can be successful?
Right.
Be flexible. Remember that the goal's the goal. The plan's not the goal. So don't be afraid to vary the plan some, as long as it's moving you towards the goal.
Right.
Okay. Work really, really hard. Like I'm not a pie in the sky person. Okay.
Hmm.
I think that you have to work really, really hard to put yourself in a position for a miracle to occur or for a door to be open.
Right.
No excuses. All right. Sure, there may be reasons why something is more difficult for you to do, but no reason why you can't accomplish it as long as you're, willing to go all out for it, put in maximum effort. And lastly, never give up. And when you reach the point that you can't go on anymore,
Hmm.
just know that that might be a critical juncture. That might be where you are on the verge of a breakthrough. So
Hmm.
even though you can't go on anymore, do it anyway, just to see what happens on the other side. And then when you cross that bridge, reach back and help somebody in the similar position.
Was powerful. If I could share one last thing, it would be I think I'm having a realization for the first time as we're speaking. And I've had conversations with people when advocating, against the death penalty many times. And there are many reasons to advocate against the death penalty. And
Correct.
one that I often say is like the margin of error. Out of,
Correct.
let's say, one out of every 100 is actually innocent, that should be enough for you to be against the death penalty. So I say that to say, whenever I speak to people who are searching to become public defenders, I always tell them this is not the work to do if you're getting in it to represent innocent people. I've always said that. I've always said like the majority of our clients represent are actually guilty,
Correct.
and that is a fact of what we do.
Yes.
However, I'm realizing that more people than we give credit to are actually innocent. And even though the majority of people that we represent are not, the few that are makes the job worth it. There should obviously be other reasons and other motivations you had to be public defender. But I do believe that defending the innocent, even if it's a small margin, should be very much so a part of that consideration. And this conversation helped me come to that realization. So thank you so much, Jeffrey, for that.
I'm happy to do that. I remember there was a study that came out that estimated that like 4% of the people on death row, for example, were innocent.
Right. And that should be enough for anybody to be,
Correct.
convicted.
I mean, look, my case had a lot of the characteristics of a capital murder. I mean, thank God for me, New York didn't have the death penalty,
Right.
and that this crime happened when I was 16
Right.
rather than 18. So
Right.
just if, but here's the elements that we're saying: is it was community outrage,
Right.
and then it was another felony involved. There was a rape along with that,
Right.
and my appeals ran out after 11 years, and I wasn't exonerated till like 5 more years. So there wouldn't have been any 2006 for Jeff Deskovic. I certainly wouldn't have been here today
Wow.
to talk to you about it.
I wish I was a bit more informed, but I believe there's somebody today who's set to be executed.
Marcellus Williams,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It is a DNA exclusion, and then the Attorney General's office has also acknowledged that there's significant due process violations, which affected the integrity of the proceedings. The Attorney General is, asking for there to be no execution, is saying that, Marcellus should get another trial. What's the problem? The problem is that the local district attorney is not agreeing to that. The Missouri Supreme Court just rejected an appeal. The governor of Mississippi, Governor Parsons, just recently denied clemency yesterday. So they were trying to do something with the U.S. Supreme Court today, but it's looking like he may be wrongfully executed. It's looking very, very likely that it will be a wrongful execution.
Wow. I wanted to end on a lighter note, but I think it's important to have shared that story.
Sure. So if people liked what they heard today, I just want to point out that there is a documentary short
Yes.
out about me, which is on Amazon Prime. It's called Conviction.
Hmm.
There are several works by that name, but obviously mine will be have the picture about me. You can follow me on social media, Instagram, Deskovic Foundation, and on Facebook and Instagram as well. The website, www.deskovic.org, DESKOVIC. There is a web form there. So if people want to email me, they can email me from there as well.
Jeffrey, it was a pleasure. I really hope to stay connected with you, post this podcast episode. I feel like there's a lot, I could learn from you, and I just would love to network further.
100%. I would love that as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, yeah, we've come to the end of this episode of the Brothers in Law podcast. I hope you were as inspired as I was, having the conversation. Please stay tuned. We have another exciting episodes coming up. But yeah, we are at our time and we have reached the end of this episode. So please take care. And yeah, we'll be back sooner than later. Take care, everybody.